Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we will have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it into the group chat, and I'll go through them in the order received. The Department of Defense defines irregular warfare as a violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over the relevant population or populations. We've discussed irregular warfare on the podcast before. You can check out Why Study Irregular Warfare in a Time of Great Power Competition that we published on July 31st of 2023. And in the second edition of the Marine Corps Tentative Manual for Advanced Base Operations, published in May of 23, states that EABO is a form of expeditionary warfare that involves the employment of mobile, low-signature, persistent, and relatively easy to maintain and sustain naval expeditionary forces from a series of austere temporary locations ashore or inshore within a contested or potentially contested maritime area in order to conduct sea denial, support sea control, or enable fleet support. Today, we're going to talk about both of these ideas in combination with each other. Our guest today is Krulak Center non-resident fellow Preston McLaughlin. He's a retired Marine colonel who served at all levels of field grade command, including CO of Combat Assault Battalion, 3rd Marine Division, and the Marine Corps Security Force Regiment in Norfolk. He also served as the course director and faculty advisor at the Amphibious Warfare School, now EWS, and is a combat veteran of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Enduring Freedom. After retirement, he taught at the Citadel and the U.S. Army War College, and he currently teaches national security policy at Texas A&M in D.C. and is part of the Bush School of Government and Public Policy. Sir, welcome back to the Brutecast, and with that, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Right. Thanks, Nate. I appreciate it. Always glad to have an opportunity to come back and discuss this subject. Since the last time you and I talked, a lot of things have occurred around the world, and it kind of ties into how we look at EABO and irregular warfare. So looking back to the fall of the previous year, 2023, October 6th and 7th in Israel with Hamas, when you look at that conflict, I think that the Israeli Defense Forces were getting complacent in a lot of ways. And what we've seen in the last couple of days is the head of military intelligence resigning his position due to the surprise attack, how successful it was against their defenses in that area. But when you look at that attack, it is almost a classic irregular warfare attack. And I think the people who were keeping surveillance on Gaza, they tried to report some of these inaccuracies, but I think people became complacent because it was very imaginative in how they conducted their attack. You know, using paragliders, using construction equipment, any means to breach barriers and to get into the areas where they wanted to wreak havoc. Now, also related to that, but tangentially, is the use of Iran's proxy warfare. You know, Iran is a big player in the region, and there is a lot of conjecture that Hamas could not conduct these attacks without some kind of support from someone like Iran. And on top of that, reinforcing fires from the Red Sea with the Houthis, conducting drone and missile strikes against shipping and coalition naval vessels, that also is deemed kind of a close nexus with Iran as proxy forces. So when you look at those events, there's a lot of irregular warfare events that have occurred in the last 7 months. And, you know, we cannot become complacent ourselves, and we need to think about that as we look to the future, especially with the South China Sea. There's some good news coming out of the South China Sea, and I think a lot of it has to do with the partnerships with Japan and with the Philippines. And I saw this morning in the military news that France is signing a visiting forces agreement with the Philippines also. So there's a lot going on. But as you and I were discussing, what should the audience, what topic should we cover with them? I felt it was better to cover what is the relationship between EABO and IW. Because when you hear the definition of IW, it kind of goes into more classic asymmetric warfare, insurgency, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. So what is the relationship to EABO? Well, as I was doing research, working on a chapter for a capstone assignment, even though I'd lived and had been on active duty during some of this period, I looked back and looked at how the Marine Corps approached IW during the Global War on Terror. And at one time in 2007, there was a Marine Corps Irregular Warfare Center that was here on Quantico. And I believe that was prompted because Department of Defense had a concept study on a couple of different functional areas, and that was one of them that was put out there. So initially, this Irregular Warfare Center was pretty much supporting operating forces as they were getting ready to deploy or deployed in theater. They would support them with different expertise issues in IW. And after that, General Amos became the next commandant, and he decided, I want to consolidate some of this work. And what he did is he consolidated security cooperation, Marine Corps advising, and the IW Center together. And a lot of it was based out of CD&I. And that went on until about 2017 when the Marine Corps conducted its last regular warfare symposium. It was sponsored by Marine Corps University Foundation and Marine Corps Association. And Bing West was one of the major panelists on there. And I thought he was a very appropriate panelist because he's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, noted author and journalist, and he had been in civic action programs in Vietnam. So he had kind of a unique perspective on IW, and his take at the panel was, in both conflicts, we kind of tied ourselves to a host nation government that was not very strong in a lot of areas. And that weakened us in a lot of ways in our approaches. And it's a very difficult approach to counter. And he says that as we continue to look to the future, we can't lose sight of those issues. Another example that I found as I was doing this research was everybody's very familiar with the Counterinsurgency FM that was published by General Mattis and General Petraeus in 2006. It was a joint study between CD&I and Fort Leavenworth. And come to find out, the Army had not published any kind of coin doctrine for 25 years. Marine Corps, 20 years. So as we were finally coming to grips to dealing with the type of conflict we're fighting and getting doctrine and best practices out there in the fleet, about that time is when the Anbar Awakening happened. And we were able to bring a successful close counterinsurgency-wise with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It did open the door for further conflict down the road with ISIS-K. And if you look at the Moscow attack recently in 2024, ISIS has not gone away. And that's something we need to keep an eye on for the future. And the current FBI director has expressed concern about the amount of chatter out there on networks that there may be an attack in the West or in the United States in the near future. So regular warfare is still there. It's still something we need to be concerned with. And what can we do about it? Well, in March, I went to a follow-on conference with the Irregular Warfare Center, which is sponsored by ASD SOLIC and Defense Security Cooperation Agency and Defense Security Cooperation University, which is where the IWC is now housed. And they had a symposium and they covered a lot of topics. They talked about technology adaptation, how that's changing when you look at the conflicts in the Red Sea and Hamas, Israel, and you look at Ukraine. They also talked about don't assume away an enemy's capability, and they brought up a review of the Hamas attack against Israel. And then they talked about creating something, a global network of functional area networks. And what these functional area networks do is they focus on trends or areas in irregular warfare, and they could be items such as intelligence, technology, medical resilience, contested logistics. So there's a lot of common themes that they're looking at that tie to EABO. In 2018, 2019, I was working with the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab as an analyst, and we were working with CD&I Futures, and we also had concepts in there, which the late Colonel Art Corbett, who was one of the primary authors of EABO, was in there as one of our government leads. And if you understand the background, and I think the Marine Corps has done a great job in the last 5 years of putting material out there for the greater community to understand what EABO is. You know, how do we fight in a contested environment where if you can be sensed, you can be killed? So we've come a long way in figuring out ways to adapt, to improvise, and overcome these issues. But I thought one thing that was very interesting is it's tied to reconnaissance, counter-reconnaissance. And if you have not read it, I highly recommend Gerald Berger's military review article about being the Joint Force Enabler. I believe it was in the fall of 2021. And I used to use this at Army War College as a primer for students there as we discuss joint multi-domain operations and EABO. So Gerald Berger lays out clearly that when you go back in time and read a lot of the Marine Corps' mission statements, we are part of the fleet in scouting and screening and looking at key terrain and maritime choke points as kind of the business of an embarked expeditionary Marine force. So using key terrain such as the Suryago Strait, Straits of Luzon, I could give you a couple of other examples, Bab el-Mandeb, Gate of Tears, Straits of Malacca. So what we need to do is capitalize on those key terrain issues, and that's where we should concentrate EABO operations with the fleet. Well, how are we going to be sure that we always have the ability to go there and work with that ally and partner? Right now, when you look at Niger and you look at Chad, they're on the cusp of taking all U.S. forces out of Niger. France has left Chad and Niger. They have a very reduced footprint there. And I think, you know, reading the tea leaves and reading a lot of other people's work and research, you know, Russia with Wagner Group and a lot of other proxies involved, they're the ones that are kind of prompting Chad and Niger to push Western powers, Western diplomacy and military out of the way. So if you don't have access, how do you do EABO? So that's why there's such a close relationship between irregular warfare, which security cooperation is only one subset or functional area of IW, but it's an important function. And as I was doing the research and looking at the Marine Corps IW Center and then consolidation of efforts, we used to have the Marine Corps Security Cooperation Group in Virginia Beach. And they were a fairly large organization. I think they became the model for the Army's SFAB units to go train, because they would have teams of experienced leaders, company and field grade and staff NCOs that would go out in their functional areas and worked with host nation countries. So as they were looking at divestiture, one of the things they did is they downsized the Marine Corps' capabilities in security cooperation, but they did not do away with it because they knew that in the future it's going to be an important area, and it's something that we support the rest of the DoD and Department of State in. So if people are not aware, there is a Marine Corps Security Cooperation Detachment in Virginia Beach, and the director is Colonel Chuck Western, one of my former students at AWS, and a Marine with a lot of experience in security cooperation in the Middle East. And so they teach the Security Cooperation Planners course, and they also teach the Marine Advisor course. So a lot of people go, what Marine advisors? Well, when I was on active duty, one of the areas I worked in was at Joint Warfighting Center in building requests for forces. Then at MAR4PAC, I was also working in requests for forces. And one of the things we looked at was, are we going to break the Army and the Marine Corps in the global war on terror by pulling so many people out to build out a hide teams to deploy and do the counterinsurgency training and security cooperation training that we need to do? So there had to be some balance put back into the effort, especially if we're going into near peer competition with great power adversaries. So the Marine Corps moved lock, stock, and barrel. Right now, there are two Marine advisor companies in the Marine Corps Reserve. One is at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, and the other one's in California. And there was talk initially of creating two more units, maybe Concord, California, and Washington State. And they are active. I had a chance to talk to some Marines that were in Kenya last year for Cutlass Express, which is an exercise that encompasses JTF Horn of Africa, 6th Fleet with Naval Forces Europe, and 5th Fleet with Naval Forces Central Command. And there were Marine advisors there on deck as part of security cooperation, and other Marines such as a fast element out of Bahrain, out of CTF 51 were there, also training and working with Kenyan Navy and Marine Corps, as well as our brothers and sisters in green from the Royal Marines that are there now. So we are doing security cooperation. There's a lot of people out there asking, are we still really doing that? I think that we have become so focused on EABO that we can't remember the old adage about the one of a nail. You know, the warrior who needed a nail for his horseshoe for his horse. You know, if we focus too deeply on peer competition, we can't forget we've got to maintain the capability to have access with allies and partners. So that's where I really see the nexus, is that as you look at the Philippines, it's a great example of cooperation. Originally under Duterte regime in the Philippines, we had a difficult time. There was even talk of pushing away the mutual defense treaty with the Philippines and the U.S. Now with President Bongbong Marcos, son of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, he has really aggressively pushed relationships with the United States. And what's interesting is they have been fighting an IW fight probably since independence, since 1946. And they deal with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Abu Sayyaf, and the New People's Army, which is a communist organization. And so their military and police teamed with us during Operation Enduring Freedom Philippines to kind of get some stability back in the South in Mindanao and Jolo. We also saw a resurgence with ISIS Philippines in Marawi, but the Filipino military has a pretty good track record when it comes to counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, civil affairs, and other functional areas inside irregular warfare. What I thought was interesting about their approach is once they started teaming and working with U.S. partners like the U.S. Coast Guard with illegal fishing, they've been able to push back on the plans, Coast Guard, and activities in Second Thomas Shoal. For example, the Chinese took barriers, which were kind of like buoys or like empty oil drums and cables, and they tried to prevent access for the Filipino fishing fleet to get into the area, which was sovereign territory for them to fish. So the president authorized the Coast Guard to go in there and remove that barrier. So it was kind of tit for tat beneath the level of armed conflict, but it was an asymmetric approach by their Coast Guard. And another favorite approach of theirs is information ops. So the Philippine Coast Guard has been filming and broadcasting whenever there's a conflict with Chinese Coast Guard or fishing fleet. And recently there was a very close call where Filipinos were severely injured. So things are getting very serious. You see Australia, you see Japan, you see Korea doing more mutual work with the Philippines. And so that's why I think the Philippines is a good example for us to look at, and in the future would be a good case study to say, okay, here's the nexus or marriage of irregular warfare and EABO and joint multi-domain operations. I've been working with another group of defense researchers and analysts, and part of our focus is on small counter UAS operations. And one of the things we saw recently is the Army just had Project Convergence in Camp Pendleton, California. What they're doing is they are experimenting with JADC2, with the Air Force, with the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Space Force. They're looking at, okay, if we are going to have a network capability and the ability to network fires and information, we need to be out and experimenting with those items now. So I was encouraged to see that that's going on, that they're actually out at Camp Pendleton and their network between Nellis and a couple of other locations so they can see how well it works. Because as you look at the Indo-PACOM AOR, it is a huge geographical expanse. And that's why it's important that we continue conducting operations with partners and allies. Like I've seen Marine Littoral regiments and other units such as the Muse going and working in Indonesia, not just Australia. They're going to several different Pacific locations so we can build up that rapport and relationship with partners and allies, which is so vital to security cooperation and foreign internal defense. Last time I came, I brought Dr. Vickers' book on his lifetime and experiences in the Department of Defense, everything from being a young enlisted soldier to going in special forces, working for the CIA, for the Department of Defense. So when you look at his book, it has a lot of lessons in IW and in policymaking and how the DoD works. So I try to bring a lot of these books to my students at Texas A&M when we get into discussions on current policy and how DoD is dealing with transformation and innovation. So one of the ones I read here recently, I'm sure y'all have seen, is Conflict by Gerald Petraeus and Andrew Roberts in the UK. And basically, they do a one over the world since 1945, and they discussed how warfare has continually adapted in 70 to 80 years. But what's very interesting is in the back, there's a chapter totally on future war and on technology, and there's also a chapter on Ukraine. So I encouraged our counter UAS training and education group to take a look at that, and I think people will find it interesting. And then as I was discussing with you before we kicked on, there's a Marine by the name of Jonathan Hackett. It's going to be on your show here pretty soon. And he has done pretty much a 20-year devotion to the study of irregular warfare. He works with Colonel Western down there in Virginia Beach. And I think you're going to be impressed with some of the theories that he's come up and the thoughts behind it. Because what he's talking about is, I'll read it to you from the back of the dust cover because I don't have it memorized. This book lays out how dysfunctional governments disrupt social orders, make territory insecure, and interfere with political economic institutions. These give rise to a form of organized violence against the state known as irregular war. So when you hear that description, that fits a lot of these conflicts where proxies are involved. And I think you and I were going to discuss Venezuela and Guyana, if you want to move into that. So a few years ago, I'd worked with Dr. Young on a McCuff-McWill sponsored conference. And at the end of it, I'd told him about Mr. Joseph Humeyer, who's a former Marine that runs the Center for a Secure Free Society. So he asked Mr. Humeyer to come in and do a presentation here at the Krulak Center. And what Mr. Humeyer gave was the background and understanding of how Maduro has gotten to where he's at today. Because he was originally the vice president for Hugo Chavez. When I was in the Western Sahara in 91, 92, we had Venezuelan and Peruvian officers in our military observer teams. Some of them went back to Venezuela for Christmas. Some of them were in the coup meeting when then Lieutenant Colonel Chavez tried to overthrow the elected government in Venezuela. So Chavez wound up going to jail. He came out, he built a network and was elected to become president. And he based a lot of it on revolutionary thought, not only Simon Bolivar, but he started looking at Hezbollah in Syria and Iran and Iraq. And if you remember a few years ago, one of his vice presidents in MOI was Tariq Assimi. He's a Syrian and Lebanese extraction. So what Mr. Humeyer did is he laid out how Chavez, like the revolutionary thought that was put into doctrine by some of these key individuals that helped found Hezbollah. And if you look throughout South America and Africa, there are expatriate Lebanese communities that deal in trade. They also deal in smuggling. Like there were groups in the United States and North Carolina that the ATF went after because they were smuggling and selling illegal cigarettes, weren't paying taxes on it. So basically what Mr. Humeyer did is he laid out, okay, they want this to be a different type of revolutionary effort. They want to take an asymmetric approach against the United States and against their neighbors in the region. And so they began this relationship where Iranian Republican Guard Corps members would come to Venezuela and visit with Chavez and then with Maduro and some of the other parts of the government. So the latest kind of crisis, because Venezuela is in dire straits economically. So the latest problem with them is they found out that their next door neighbor, the former British Guyana, the country of Guyana, has one of the largest oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere. So how this conflict or contest between Maduro and Guyana came about was in the 60s when the British left, there was a border dispute that internationally was resolved in favor of Guyana. Now Venezuela is saying it's part of their traditional territory. So Venezuela has received Iranian patrol boats, missile boats from Iran. They were using an airplane to fly through the Caribbean and Latin America, Africa, back to Iran to exchange material. The United States helped the country of Argentina under the new government of Milei to impound and take over that aircraft to prevent that from being used. But Venezuela is still claiming that the United States and Southcom are wanting, along with Guyana, are wanting to wreak havoc on Venezuela. Venezuela has been working with the new regime in Colombia also, which a lot of them were in the FARC previously. So when you look at the potential for nefarious activities and you read Mr. Hackett's description, the potential in the Western Hemisphere for irregular warfare to be conducted against U.S. and our regional allies in the Western Hemisphere, the possibility is there. Possibility for it to continue, as we've seen recently, is there because we are so engaged in so many different locations right now. So that's the dilemma. Where should we concentrate our efforts? And so that's why the Irregular Warfare Center exists. They brought in addition to their European session they had with academics, they just recently had people from Singapore, India, Ceylon, Philippines come in and discuss what they think about irregular warfare and what they think about functional area networks. And within a year, the functional area networks have to brief back the IWC and ASD SOLIC on where they're at with these global networks and what solutions and ideas they've come up with these functional area networks. So that kind of covers most of the material for today. So I'm going to turn it over to you for further.
Yeah, so for those in the chat, if you have any questions, just go ahead and put those in. I'll answer them as they get asked. I think my big question is, so we talked a lot about IW. We talked, Iraq, Afghanistan, doing, asymmetric warfare, irregular warfare. I think it went through about 4 or 5 different names while we were over there. But there was a lot that we had to do, patrols, interacting with the populace. How does that change when we have much smaller forces at these EABOs? I think, expeditionary bases have kind of changed over time. They were supposed to be small, and then they got very large, and then they got very small again. It's kind of, give the TBS answer of it's met TSL on how big and what it's going to do. But how does irregular warfare kind of affect that element of EABO?
Oh, that's a great question. And, one of the things to think about is we've got partners and allies. So what is kind of the division of labor with partners and allies? When you look at the Philippine military, their command authorities are devolved into regional area commands, like Central Command, Southern Command. So I think they should kind of be the lead in determining interaction with local populace. I think the challenge will be moving frequently, learning to mass signatures frequently. So that's kind of where U.S. forces, I think, are going to be very involved. I think there's going to be some times where you don't have a choice. Sometimes you're going to have to be in direct conflict through no fault of your own, just as the circumstances that come up. And the best way to prepare for those is constantly do walkthroughs and talks with your folks and rehearsing, okay, if this happens, what are we going to do? What are we going to do next? And the beauty of the current IWC construct is they see other actors in the joint and combined interagency that could probably help us and relieve us of some of the burdens of the things we were doing before, like civil affairs. So there is a way to leverage the joint interagency to let us get on with the primary business of EABO. Just resupplying ourselves, keeping communications going, because you're looking at huge distances. So I think over time, as we begin to work more closely with those partners and allies, we will come up with a division of labor on how that's going to occur. And I think that the current exercise program going on seems to be hitting the mark on it. I can tell you, I was in 3MEF G3 before I was with Combat Assault Battalion, and we used to have tons of exercises back then. Same thing at Marine Forces Pacific. So I think we may have even increased the number of exercises we're doing right now because there's more people that want to be involved, like the United Kingdom, France, New Zealand, that weren't really hugely involved before. So, we have the vehicle or venue to make that work.
Yeah, then my next question, because we brought up the Philippines a couple of times, do you think the conflict in the Philippines, in Mindanao, against the Moral Islamic Liberation Front and those other forces, do you think that is a good approximation of what we think IW in the EAB environment is going to look like? Or do you think that it's more going to be a combination of that and what we're seeing in Ukraine? I think, the last time we talked, I feel like Ukraine wasn't as big with the first-person drones, but then since then, it's definitely picked up a lot in the last 7, 8, 9 months. And I think that's kind of changed how we view irregular warfare significantly.
Did you see the War on the Rocks article that Travis Reese, Leo Spader, I think Ian might have been on there too? And
I didn't get a chance to read it, but I'm aware of it. Yeah.
I thought they did a very good job of saying, okay, this validates some of the concepts, because when you look at the Red Sea and what's going on, you look at the Black Sea and what's going on, and we haven't even gotten into the Baltics yet. And when you look at the Baltics with the archipelago and the way their defense forces are organized, the potential to do EABO in more than one theater is out there. I think that it's probably more like Ukraine with the Black Sea, maybe. I think that other partners and allies are starting to wake up to a lot of these issues. I just saw recently that Australia and New Guinea are starting to cooperate more again. Because when you look at New Guinea, it was used as a piece of key terrain to cut off the Japanese in Rabaul and the Solomons, and then also for coast watching with what was going on with the Japanese fleet. And so I think a lot of our partners and allies are starting to wake up and understand the value and utility of concepts like EABO.
Yeah, I think that leads into my next question is I think when we talk EABO and really IW as well, because we talked about, the host, I don't want to say host government, but, the government that runs those particular areas, I think that the issues are very different. What 2MEF is going to have to deal with in the archipelagos in the Baltics is very different than what 1MEF and 3MEF are going to have to deal with EABs in the Pacific.
No, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. I think that each one of them is going to have to tailor eventually to the specific scenarios are going to be dealt in those areas. Because when you look at the Baltics and you look at Arctic warfare, 2MEF is probably going to have it. And we really have not done a lot of large-scale operations like that in a while until recently. When you look at the Navy and Marine Corps large-scale operations, we're starting to do it again. I think CG2MEF was very heavily involved in the last one. How about the Mediterranean? 2MEF and 6th Fleet. That's a tough, they kind of have to train for both theaters, but can it be done? Yes. I can remember a brigadier general and then major general by the name of Al Gray, who was with 4th MAB, and he had been in the Mediterranean quite a bit, but then when he was the 4th MAB CG, he was involved in Northern Wedding Bowl Guard and working up in Norway, the Baltics, and Kiel Canal in Germany. So very diverse geography, terrain, weather. I think there's going to be challenges for all three of those MEFs as they operate.
I think that goes in, we had some of the folks from the Swedish Defense Force on a couple weeks ago, talking about the Swedish military and kind of the terrain that they work in. And that's when I realized that that's the largest archipelago in the world, is there between Sweden and Finland, our newest partners in NATO. But I think, how does the government that owns those areas, not just in the Baltics, but in general, if they have claim to uninhabited islands, how does the goodness or the badness, the capabilities of that government, how does that affect IW and the EABAs that might be set up on those islands?
Well, it's interesting because we've had a lot of those countries come and participate in the IW centers, academic calls where they have somebody come in and explain their definition of hybrid warfare. Their problem sets are a little bit different than our problem sets. Like they look at, it's called the national resistance concept. How do you mobilize your entire society? I think the Finns have had a leg up on that for 80 years because of their last president, Field Marshal Mannerheim, who had fought in the Winter War. Had been in the Russian army under the Tsar. And so they said, hey, we need to come to some kind of balance, but we need to be self-reliant, self-defense. So when you look at Sweden, you look at Denmark, you look at Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they all have unique problem sets. If they have territory that they don't claim, the danger with the Russians is something called fait accompli. Have you had anybody use the term fait accompli? So when Dr. Young and I were working on that project, we had a academic from Georgia. It was Georgia Southern University, and he publishes on this. Just Google fait accompli, and his name will come up. But he was talking about how, like, Turkey seized Cyprus in the 70s, where if they push a little bit more, and they don't think they're going to be attacked by a defending force, they'll just go ahead and take the territory. So is the potential there for that with the Russians? I think so. I mean, when you look at Crimea, that's exactly what they were doing in 2014, was pushing. China, I think, has done it in some of the other South China Sea islands, like with Vietnam and other areas further west. But yeah, it's a huge problem for those smaller countries. And so that's why they're so reliant on alliances and partnerships.
Yeah. And then the last question I had written down, you had talked about JADC2. So anytime we start talking about digital interoperability or communication systems that can reach back and talk to other folks, and talking about the tyranny of distance within the Pacific itself, EABs being able to talk to other EABs, or being able to talk back to mother or somebody else. But then you couple that with being inside the WES, and we talk about A2AD. How does that affect IW? How does that affect those EABs? And do we really want to rely on that as the means of communication?
Yeah, you're right. It's the toughest part of the problem. The puzzle is how do you do command and control? How do you connect? And we've made better strides on JADC2. Initially, we weren't. I think it was going too slowly, too lethargic. And I think under Joe Milley, he kind of assigned the Army and the Air Force science projects and said, you will come up with a solution. And so it's gotten better over time. I think the other thing is when you look at quantum computing also allows you to do burst transmission. So United States cannot fall behind in this tech area. I think there are other countries that are working more aggressively with it. I think we're also rediscovering HF, that you can use HF. Is it totally 100% reliable? No. Sometimes it's not going to work. But it is the biggest piece of the problem, and I encourage you to read the articles and after actions coming out of Project Convergence. I was kind of surprised that they were doing it at Camp Pendleton, but when you think about it, it's probably no better place because you have such a diverse ecosphere with Fort Irwin, the National Training Center, Nellis Air Force Base, so it's a good area to test those long range comms and capabilities.
So I think my last question, and we don't have any in the chat. So is there something we need to do now that we're not doing in order to protect EABs in regards to IW? Is there something that we need to continue working on that we're doing now, but we still have a ways to go? And is there something that we've already sort of nailed? We just need to make sure that we maintain.
Well, I think the functional area networks, there's a lot of convergence between what EABO is doing and what these functional area networks are looking at. So if there are people in the Marine Corps, and especially MCU or the Warfighting Lab, I encourage you to reach out to the Irregular Warfare Center. In fact, they actually have on their website the description of the fans, what they're doing, and they also have an email for IW Global Network, and it's called fan@irregularwarfarecenter.org. I'll leave this one with you if you want.
Sure.
How about allies and partners? I think allies and partners are more aware of the environment. Remember Combat Hunter? Remember how do you know what's normal when it's around you? I think in EABO, that's even more critical with your allies and partners is what's normal, what's around us. I did a master's thesis here at Command and Staff College many years ago, 95, 96, and it was about a joint U.S. and nationalist Chinese organization called SACO Naval Group China. And the beauty of that partnership was that we provide the technical training and advice and equipment, and the nationalist Chinese intelligence service provided the people to include guerrillas, coast watchers, that type work. And what they did is they knew that a Westerner would have a hard time surviving in an Asian environment if you don't look Asian. And so they guarded very jealously their American advisors. I think only one American advisor was captured during the entire period of its operation, and all the rest of them were protected by the populace. The local populace was encouraged by the local Chinese guerrilla chief to provide intelligence or information to Japanese and Japanese puppet forces that were around them. So, we got to realize some of these places that we're going to are very, very foreign and distinct from the Western world. And we need to rely on allies and partners sometimes to help us navigate that world and help keep our people safe from a force protection point of view.
Sure. So we're quickly approaching our hour. So I wanted to turn it over to you real quick to give you any closing comments, and then we'll close out for the day.
Well, I tell you, I encourage folks to read more, learn more, go to the Irregular Warfare Center site. I think you're going to have a great session with Jonathan Hackett talking about his book. If you're in the Marine Corps Reserve and you have not thought about Marine Advisor duty, it's a pretty good gig. I mean, you either work out of California or JBAB, and you're put together in teams, and you are basically there for your functional area, and you're training allies and partners. So it's a good way to learn security cooperation. It's a good way to get into that security cooperation planners course. And also the MAR 4s do security cooperation. That's how they develop their exercise programs. I think a lot of people thought advisors and security cooperation went away. We said we're doing great power competition. They weren't thinking of it from the perspective of it being an enabler and enabling EABO to be a joint enabler for the reconnaissance, counter-reconnaissance fight for the fleet and the joint force. So again, as always, thank you for the opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for your time and your insight today. For all the folks who have joined us today or tune in later, thanks for joining us. And with that, that's all we have for today. So go ahead and carry out the plan of the day. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.